The tension in the room was palpable, thick with an energy that hung in the air like a storm on the brink of breaking. Every eye was trained on the two women at the front of the room, their faces set in expressions that promised something momentous was about to unfold. Pam Bondi, the seasoned political figure known for her sharp wit and no-nonsense approach, stood with an air of unshakable confidence. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett, the young and rising star in politics, had the look of someone who thought they could control the narrative. But today, something was about to change. Pam Bondi had always been the kind of person who never shied away from a confrontation. But this was different. She had done her homework, uncovered something so shocking about Crockett's past that it threatened to unravel everything the young politician had built. Bondi could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. And as the cameras flashed and the audience hushed, she knew there was no turning back now. The press conference was meant to be a routine political discussion, a simple back and forth about policy, public perception, and the future of the country. But something had shifted. Bondi had come prepared, and her eyes scanned the room as she spoke, her voice calm but carrying the weight of what was to come. "You all know Jasmine Crockett," she began, her tone measured yet pointed. "The rising star in politics, the darling of the progressive movement. But what you don't know, what none of you know, is the truth about her past. A past she's done everything in her power to hide." The room went still. There was no applause, no immediate reaction, just silence. Bondi's words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down, daring anyone to deny the truth that was about to be revealed. Had anyone truly wondered why Crockett's rise had been so meteoric, so smooth, without a single scandal to slow her down? Could it be that her past was carefully buried beneath layers of polished public relations? And what if that past was far darker, far more complex than anyone had imagined? These were the questions that raced through the minds of everyone in the room, but no one dared to ask them aloud. Not yet. Bondi's eyes flickered to Crockett, whose face had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by a hint of wariness that had not been there moments before. Was it fear? Was it guilt? Or perhaps a deep sense of dread that came from knowing someone had uncovered the truth? For years, Crockett had been able to portray herself as the ideal politician, untouched by scandal, a symbol of the progressive movement, an inspiration to young voters everywhere. But how could anyone truly trust someone with such a perfect image? Bondi had spent weeks digging, researching, connecting the dots, and now she was about to make sure that no one would look at Crockett the same way again. "What if I told you," Bondi continued, her voice growing colder, sharper with each word, "that Jasmine Crockett's past isn't as clean as she's let you believe? What if I told you that she's been hiding something that could destroy everything she's worked so hard to build?" The room tensed, the collective breath of the crowd held in suspense. Was Bondi about to name names? To expose a secret that would bring Crockett's career crashing down? Or was this all part of the political theater that had been building over the last few weeks? The uncertainty was almost unbearable. But then Bondi dropped the bombshell. "Jasmine, Crockett has a history," she said, her eyes locking with Crockett's. "A history that involves actions she's tried to erase from her life. But I'm here to make sure that history doesn't stay buried." Crockett's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as the room seemed to close in on her. This wasn't what she had expected. Not at all. She had assumed she could weather any storm, that her public image would protect her. But now, in the face of Bondi's accusations, everything she had worked for felt fragile, like glass about to shatter. Bondi could see the shift in Crockett's demeanor, the way her body language betrayed a woman who was not as invincible as she had once appeared. Crockett's flawless facade was cracking, and the weight of the truth was starting to press against her. But it wasn't enough to make Bondi back down. In fact, it was only fueling her determination. "Why don't we give the public what they deserve?" Bondi said, her voice now laced with a sharp edge. "It's time they know the real Jasmine Crockett. Let's take a look at the truth." And with that, Bondi stepped aside, signaling for a series of documents and images to be displayed on the large screen behind her. The room fell even quieter, if that was possible, as the first image flashed onto the screen. What followed was a series of photos, documents, and evidence that painted a picture of Crockett's past that no one had seen before. The room's atmosphere shifted from disbelief to stunned silence. People began to whisper among themselves, trying to process what they were seeing. Some of the images were old, dating back to a time before Crockett had entered the public eye, while others were more recent, depicting associations and actions that directly contradicted the image she had so carefully crafted. Had Jasmine Crockett been hiding ties to controversial figures? Had she been involved in actions that undermined the very values she claimed to support? The room buzzed with questions, but there was one question that everyone in the room was now asking. How could she have kept this secret for so long, Pam? Bondi stood with a quiet, almost grim satisfaction, watching as the truth began to unfold. This was just the beginning. The silence in the room was deafening, but it was the kind of silence that preceded a storm that would have far-reaching consequences. As the last image flashed on the screen, a heavy silence lingered in the room. It wasn't just disbelief. It was the kind of silence that comes with realization. The kind of silence when everyone knows that something monumental has just been revealed, and there's no going back. Eyes darted between Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett, who now stood frozen, her face pale as the weight of her hidden past became all too real. For a moment it seemed as though Crockett might speak, but her lips trembled and no words came. What could she say? How could she explain away the evidence that Bondi had so carefully laid out for everyone to see? The images on the screen told a story far different from the one Crockett had spent years cultivating. A story of connections and events that were anything but the idealistic narrative she had sold to the public. Bondi could see it in her eyes. The fight had gone out of her. The powerful politician who had once seemed so sure of herself now looked like a cornered animal, desperately searching for a way to escape, to deny the reality that was crashing down on her. But Bondi wasn't about to give her an out. "I'm sure you've had some time to think about this, Jasmine," Bondi said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "But I want the public to hear it from you. How do you explain the connections we just saw? How do you explain your past actions?" Crockett finally found her voice, but it wasn't the confident, commanding tone she was known for. There was a quiver in her words, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "This is all a misunderstanding," she stammered. "Those photos, those documents, there's an explanation for all of it." Explain it then," Bondi interrupted, her gaze unwavering. "Explain how you, the darling of the progressive movement, have been associated with people and actions that directly contradict the values you claim to represent. How do you explain your involvement with individuals whose actions are the very antithesis of everything you've publicly supported?" Crockett's eyes flitted from Bondi to the screen, where the evidence continued to flash, each image more damning than the last. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. The truth was now in the open, and there was no easy way out. The room was charged with energy now, reporters and journalists scrambling to process what had just happened. Whispers filled the air as they turned to one another, trying to make sense of the scandal they had just witnessed. Some were skeptical, wondering if this was a political stunt, a calculated move by Bondi to destroy her rival. Others, however, were beginning to question Crockett's entire political identity. But one thing was certain: the public's trust was at stake. For every moment that Crockett failed to respond, the more the room seemed to turn against her. Bondi knew it was a race against time now. The longer Crockett stayed silent, the more her credibility eroded. "You want to play the hero?" Bondi pressed, her tone sharp now, no longer polite or diplomatic. Then show us who you really are. Tell us why these connections matter. Tell us why you've hidden them for so long. Because the people deserve to know the truth. Crockett stood there, her face a mix of desperation and defiance. She was trapped. There was no escape from this. But she wasn't ready to collapse just yet. She had fought too hard to get to where she was, and the thought of losing it all because of a few pictures, a few bad decisions, felt unbearable. "Fine," Crockett said, her voice low but steady. "I won't lie. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I was involved with people I shouldn't have been involved with. But that doesn't define me. It doesn't define who I am now. I've worked harder than anyone to change. I've worked to make amends for my past. And I've fought to be a voice for people who have been ignored, for the marginalized, for the oppressed." There was a flicker of determination in Crockett's eyes, but it wasn't enough to convince the room. Bondi wasn't satisfied with the answer, and neither was the audience. "So what you're saying," Bondi retorted, "is that you've spent your entire career hiding behind a facade, pretending to be someone you're not? You've built your political career on lies, on a story you've fabricated to make people think you're something you're not?" Crockett's face tightened. "That's not what I'm saying at all," she snapped. "I'm saying that people grow, people learn, people change. And yes, I made mistakes. But that's not the person I am today. You can't judge me by my past alone." "But your past matters, Jasmine," Bondi countered, her voice cold, calculating. "Your past is what shapes who you are, no matter how hard you try to distance yourself from it. And the truth is, people like you have been lying to the public for too long. And I'm here to make sure they know who you really are." The crowd murmured in agreement, the sentiment of doubt creeping into the room like a slow, inevitable tide. For every word Crockett said, Bondi's accusations seemed to strike harder. The room was no longer on Crockett's side. It was on Bondi's. And the longer Crockett stood there trying to defend herself, the more she seemed like a woman out of her depth, unable to control the narrative she had once so easily manipulated. But even then, Crockett wasn't ready to give up completely. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice grew more forceful. "You want the truth? Fine, I'll give you the truth. But you'll regret it. Because when I rise again, when I come back from this, you'll wish you hadn't pushed me so hard." The room fell, silent again, the gravity of her words sinking in. Had she just threatened Bondi? Or was she simply speaking in the heat of the moment? Either way, the tension had escalated. The battle lines were drawn. The air in the room seemed to freeze, the weight of Crockett's words hanging like an impending storm. The reporters, once scribbling furiously, now paused, their pens hovering over notebooks as if afraid to miss the next dramatic twist. For a moment it seemed as though Bondi was considering how to respond. But there was no hesitation in her eyes. She had already won. The quiet confidence in her posture spoke volumes. She had forced Crockett into a corner, and now she was going to finish what she had started. Bondi leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving Crockett. "Regret?" she said, her voice calm, even eerily so. "You want to talk about regret, Jasmine? You have no idea what it feels like to regret your actions, to look back on the damage you've caused and realize there's no way to fix it. You've been running from the truth for years, hiding behind a persona that doesn't exist." Crockett flinched, her defiance wavered for a split second. The truth was that no matter how many times she told herself she had grown, the past always found a way to catch up with her. It wasn't just the pictures or the documents. Those were merely a symptom of the bigger problem. It was the choices she had made, the compromises she had accepted, the people she had aligned herself with in the pursuit of power. And now, every bit of that history was laid bare, for everyone to see. But Crockett wasn't ready to back down. Not now. Not in front of the cameras. Not in front of the nation. She stood taller, the fire returning to her eyes. "You can't destroy me with your words, Pam," she shot back, her voice rising with intensity. "I've faced far worse than this. And I'm still standing. For the first time in the entire exchange, Bondi's smirk faltered. It was only for a second, but it was enough to show that even she, the seasoned political veteran, was surprised by Crockett's resilience. But Bondi quickly regained her composure, pressing forward with the force of a freight train. "You want to pretend like your past doesn't matter, Jasmine?" Bondi retorted. "You want to sweep it under the rug and pretend you're a victim of circumstance? It doesn't work that way. You can't erase the truth, no matter how much you try to rewrite your own history." Crockett's fists clenched at her sides, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. She had spent years cultivating a public image that was carefully crafted to appeal to the masses. Now it was all falling apart. Was this how she would be remembered? As a fraud, a woman who had hidden behind lies for the sake of her career? The thought made her stomach turn, but she refused to let it show. Bondi's words were like daggers, and with each one, Crockett felt a little more of her carefully constructed world slip away. "I've worked hard for everything I have," Crockett said, her voice shaking now, but not with fear. No, it was more than that. It was the frustration of realizing that no matter how hard she fought, she couldn't outrun her past. "I've sacrificed. I've done the work. You can't take that away from me." But Bondi wasn't listening. She wasn't interested in Crockett's defense. She was only interested in the truth, the real story that the public needed to hear. And she was ready to bring it to the surface, no matter what it took. "You don't get to play the victim here, Jasmine," Bondi said, her voice cold. "You've spent years building your career on a foundation of lies. You've hid behind your past, hoping no one would ever dig deep enough to find the truth. But I'm here to make sure the world knows exactly who you are, and no amount of spin or deflection is going to change that." The room was so still, it felt like the air had thickened, like even time itself had slowed. The journalists sat on the edge of their seats, eyes darting between the two women, waiting for the next shocking revelation. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the cameras. Everyone knew that the turning point had come. This was the moment where everything could change. For Crockett, the weight of the moment pressed against her chest like a vice. She had built her career on a carefully constructed narrative, one that had taken years to develop. And now, with each word Bondi spoke, that narrative was crumbling to dust. Was it all for nothing? Was everything she had worked for going to be undone in one fell swoop? But then, something shifted in Crockett's expression. It was subtle at first, a flicker of something that could have been recognition, or perhaps the beginning of acceptance. Was it possible that Bondi's accusations were the wake-up call she needed? Was it possible that, for once, she could step into the light and confront her past head-on, instead of continuing to run from it? Crockett's shoulders straightened, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she looked Bondi square in the eye. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, her voice low but unwavering. "You think that by exposing my past, you've somehow made me less than who I am. But I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding. What I did, who I was, it doesn't define who I am now. And I'm not going to let you use my past to tear me down." Bondi's lips twisted into a knowing smile, but there was something different about her expression now. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't triumph. It was something darker, something that suggested she knew exactly what was coming next, and that it was going to change everything. The room was no longer a place of conflict. It was a battlefield, where two women, with their own ambitions and ideals, were about to collide in a way that would shape the future of their careers, and perhaps even the political landscape itself. The tension in the room thickened, a quiet storm brewing between Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett. It was clear now that this wasn't just a political confrontation. It was personal. Bondi had exposed Crockett's hidden past, but it was Crockett's refusal to crumble under the weight of that exposure that truly threw the room into disarray. No one had expected this kind of resilience, No one had expected her to stand firm in the face of a full-blown scandal and challenge Bondi in such a direct way. The dynamic had shifted once again. Crockett's words hung in the air like a challenge. She wasn't going to be the scapegoat, the woman who would buckle under pressure. She wasn't going to let Pam Bondi define her. And yet, for all of Crockett's defiance, there was still something in the air that suggested Bondi wasn't done. This was far from over. Pam Bondi took a step closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and for a moment it seemed as though she might deliver another biting retort, but instead she paused, surveying Crockett with a look that was equal parts calculating and knowing. She had seen women like Crockett before, those who believed they could weather any storm, but in the end, the truth always had a way of catching up. "Is that it, Jasmine?" Bondi's voice was softer now, almost condescending. "Is that your defense? That you've changed? That your past doesn't matter anymore? I hope you realize that's not how this works. People will remember who you were. You can try to distance yourself from your mistakes, but the reality is this. Your past isn't something you can erase." Crockett's face tightened, her chest rising and falling with every breath as she fought to maintain control. For a moment, the flood of emotions was too much. Anger, frustration, guilt, and it threatened to overwhelm her. But she held on. She wasn't going to let Bondi see her crack. Not now. Not in front of the world. "People may remember who I was," Crockett said, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet fire. "But they will also remember who I've become. I've fought for justice, for equality, for the values I believe in. You can't take that away from me, Pam." Bondi's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to take anything away from you," she replied, her voice low and dangerous. "You're doing that to yourself. Every time you speak, every time you try to defend the indefensible, you make it worse. You've already done the damage, Jasmine, and now you have to live with the consequences." Crockett opened her mouth to argue, but Bondi raised her hand, signaling for her to stop. "No more excuses," Bondi said, her tone sharp. "The truth has been laid out for everyone to see, and no amount of deflection or spin will change that. Your past is part of you whether you like it or not. You can try to hide behind your so-called progressivism, but the truth is, you've been living a lie." For a split second, Crockett seemed to falter. The weight of Bondi's words, the steady, unrelenting pressure, threatened to buckle her resolve. She had spent years building her career on a carefully crafted image, and now it felt as though it was all unraveling in real time. But then, something changed. Crockett squared her shoulders, her eyes locking with Bondi's, with a renewed sense of purpose. "Maybe you're right," she said, her voice now quiet but firm. "Maybe my past will always follow me, but I won't apologize for who I am today. I won't let you define my future based on mistakes I've made in the past." It was a powerful statement, one that reverberated through the room. For the first time, there was a sense of control in Crockett's words, a sense that she was taking back the narrative, not from Bondi, but from the past that had always threatened to drag her down. The room, once charged with tension, felt different now. The audience, reporters, and even Bondi herself seemed to take a collective breath, as though the air had been cleared, if only for a moment. Bondi, though, wasn't ready to let go just yet. She pressed on, her voice dripping with the satisfaction of a woman who believed she had the upper hand. "You may not apologize, Jasmine," she said, her gaze piercing. "But the truth is, you've already lost. You're not the shining star you thought you were. The public is already turning on you. They see through the lies. They see through your carefully constructed image, and no matter how hard you try to fight it, it's over." The words hit hard, each one landing with precision. But Crockett wasn't going to let Bondi have the last word. Not after everything she had been through. Not after fighting so hard to get here. "I'm not done yet," Crockett said, her voice now ringing with conviction. "You may think you've won, but you haven't. This isn't the end of my story. It's just the beginning." With that, Crockett turned, her heels clicking with determination, as she made her way to the door, leaving Bondi standing in the center of the room, her smug smile faltering as she realized that Crockett was not backing down. As the door closed behind Crockett, the room erupted into whispers and murmurs. What had just happened? Had Crockett just won? Was this her triumph? The moment she had taken control of her own narrative in spite of Bondi's best efforts? Or was this just another chapter in a story that was far from over? One thing was certain. Pam Bondi's attempt to destroy Jasmine Crockett had not gone as planned. The young politician had faced the truth, confronted her past, and walked out of that room still standing. And while the battle for public perception was far from over, it was clear that Crockett had proven something far more important, that her resilience, her ability to face the darkest parts of her story, was what would define her from here on out. The door to the room closed with a definitive thud, leaving a profound silence in its wake. The atmosphere hung thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. Journalists, reporters, and even Bondi herself were left to process the aftermath of an encounter that had started with an avalanche of accusations but ended with a startling turn of events. Was it possible that Crockett had actually won this round? Bondi stood there, her eyes fixed on the now empty door, her hands clenched at her sides. There was no satisfaction in her posture, no sense of victory, only the faintest flicker of uncertainty. She had come into that room expecting to tear Crockett apart, to expose her as a fraud. But now, Bondi was left grappling with something she hadn't anticipated: Crockett's resilience. Her refusal to break, to let Bondi shape her narrative, had turned the tables in ways that could never have been predicted. The room buzzed with a mixture of disbelief and awe. Reporters scrambled to their feet, murmuring amongst themselves, eager to share what they had just witnessed. The scandal that Bondi had so meticulously engineered had shifted into something more, something larger than anyone had expected. This wasn't just about one politician trying to take down another. It was about the public's perception, about the fragility of political personas, and about the way the truth could be manipulated, shaped, and sometimes even overcome. As Bondi stood there, her expression tightening with the realization that she hadn't won, she could feel the tide turning. There would be no easy recovery from this. The backlash was already beginning, a ripple effect of public support for Crockett that was growing stronger by the minute. The social media buzz, the online comments, the live reactions, it all pointed in one direction. Crockett was not done. She had walked out of that room not defeated, but emboldened. The cameras outside the door captured every moment, broadcasting it live for the world to see. And the world was watching. For the first time in years, the American public had been forced to confront something real, something raw. No political game, no scripted narrative could hide the truth of what had just happened. Crockett had faced the darkness of her past and come out the other side, still standing. And in that moment, her credibility, her resolve, was more powerful than any scandal Bondi could manufacture. Across social media, commentators and analysts were quick to dissect the fallout. Bondi thought she had Crockett cornered, one analyst said. But what she didn't count on was Crockett's ability to turn the tables, to confront the very thing that most politicians would rather sweep under the rug. This was not just a moment of survival. It was a triumph. The reporters in the room began to rush to their phones, typing furiously, drafting their takes on what had just unfolded. Some were still skeptical, unsure if Crockett had truly overcome the scandal, but others saw it as a defining moment, a victory not just for Crockett, but for anyone who had ever been judged by their past mistakes. And Crockett, she wasn't done. Yet. She knew the battle wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, more hurdles to overcome, and the public's trust would be an ongoing effort. But for the first time in a long time, she had taken control of her narrative. She had confronted The truth, owned it, and shown the world that it didn't define her. What had once been her greatest vulnerability had become her strength. Crockett's return to the political spotlight was inevitable. It wasn't just a fight for power. It was a fight for identity, for redemption. And she had won this round, not through manipulation, not through deceit, but through the raw power of facing her own truths and refusing to let them break her. As she left the building, Crockett walked past the throngs of reporters who had once doubted her. Their eyes followed her, now filled with a mixture of respect and curiosity. She had taken their harshest criticism, their toughest questions, and walked away with her head held high. The next chapter of her political career was already being written, but it would be written on her own terms. And Pam Bondi? She would have to regroup. The political game she had tried to play with Crockett's reputation had backfired. In trying to destroy her opponent, she had unwittingly given Crockett the chance to prove herself stronger than ever. The room had gone silent when the truth was revealed. But now, that silence was filled with the echoes of a hard-won triumph. The camera crews outside continued to roll, capturing Crockett's determined stride as she entered the waiting car. The world was watching. And for the first time in a long time, the public wasn't just watching a politician. They were witnessing the raw, unfiltered truth of someone who refused to let the past define her future.